Hi everybody, it's February 5th, 2025, and I'm in one of my happy places, the McDonald's, where I actually used to work here. After I lost my house in foreclosure, I found an apartment nearby in Coquitlam, and I started by washing dishes at McDonald's at, I think I was 60, after practicing law most of my life. But anyways, I've been posting these videos as a form of therapy to recover from the trauma of watching my little brother, Paul Kierans, with Down syndrome, who I had grew up with and who I lived within 35 or 30 kilometers for the last 35 years, be locked up in his group home, L'Arche, L'Arche, by the BC New Democratic Party government, David Eby and the BC New Democratic Party government, for 588 days. And then I believe they killed him, and I'll explain that in a minute. So on August 26th of 2022, I complained to the Burnaby RCMP about what I believe to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney that the government group home had created to give Paul a COVID-19 shot. And what I believe the person that interviewed me did was she just tipped off the group home that I had complained. She didn't investigate. She didn't investigate my complaint. She just told them that I had complained. So they had their lawyer, Tara Britnell, Britnell, write me a letter, or write my sister, who the government, I have a nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario, who's a nun who left home when Paul was born. She's 16 years older than him, and had only met him a few times over the course of his life. But the government appointed her as his substitute decision maker, this evil nun as his substitute decision maker. And so the group home wrote the evil nun and said that they would terminate Paul's residency with them, although certainly the BC government had 1,000 other places to place him. But the group home, L'Arche, threatened to terminate his residency after he lived with them for 35 years if she didn't terminate permanently my visits with Paul. So rather than just waiting for the police investigation into the fraudulent forged power of attorney to be resolved, their response was to terminate his visits with me. The level of corruption is like Central American Salvador before the current regime, like as corrupt and evil as you can get. And I thought that decision to terminate his visits, and that meant I was his last surviving family member and visitor, so that meant isolating him to the group home. And they did that for 588 days. Then he had some kind of brain incident. On April 15th of 2024, I got an email from the evil nun's Vancouver lawyer. She had two law firms working for her, an Ottawa law firm and a Vancouver law firm, like top-notch, top-flight, expensive law firms. I estimate the Catholic Church spent $1 million on the evil nun's representation. So I got an email from her lawyer saying that my brother had had a stroke, which I don't believe is true. But anyways, he said that I could arrange a visit through him at the hospital. So I dropped everything. This was April 15th. I dropped everything. I jumped in a cab and went to the hospital. And I walked into the room, and Paul looked comatose. But I said, "Paul, it's Kathleen." And he grabbed my hand and he squeezed it so tight like a vice. I couldn't believe it. And he just held on. But they made me leave after 10 minutes. So for the next 10 days, I just sat in the lobby for 10 to 12 hours a day. The evil nun flew. What I found out is that whatever happened, and Paul could have been hit, he could have been injured. He had a wound on the side of his head, on the right side of his head, that was oozing blood. So he could have fallen at the group home, or he could have been hit by someone, or he could have had a stroke, or he could have had a brain bleed. I don't know. They would not tell me anything about his medical condition at all, nothing whatsoever. So I went back, and I was allowed a 10-minute visit once a day by the evil nun. So she, they waited 2 days to see if he was going to die. What happened actually happened. I spoke with him. I was allowed a 10-minute telephone call once a week on Friday at 4:30. So I had my April 12th telephone call. And Paul sounded so lonely. He begged for me to visit with him. I recorded every telephone call. He repeatedly said he loved me. He begged. He said, "Kathleen, take me to a movie." They had him locked up good. It's the worst miscarriage of justice in Canadian history, and Canada's got some real doozies with Donald Marshall and Guy Paul Morin, and there's the three, they call them the 3 M's. David, what's his name? Anyways, Canada has had a string of egregious miscarriages of justice, but this really outdoes them all because Paul was locked up for 588 days. I went to the Supreme Court of Canada twice. I was refused leave to appeal. The most nonsensical crap you can imagine has been granted leave to appeal. But the isolation and confinement of a 64-year-old Canadian citizen for 588 days didn't merit the scrutiny of the Supreme Court of Canada. But remember, a lot of people don't know this, but the Supreme Court of Canada overturned the jury acquittal of Guy Paul Morin in the murder of that little girl in Ontario, that little 10-year-old girl. So he was acquitted by a jury, and the Supreme Court of Canada overturned the acquittal. So I don't know if you know the concept of double jeopardy. I don't know how they got around that, but the Supreme Court of Canada set it aside, and then ultimately it was shown by DNA that Guy Paul Morin, of course, did not murder that little girl, whose name escapes me, I'm sorry to say. And they found out who, it was a family friend who had raped and murdered the little girl, not Guy Paul Morin. But I think what they did to Paul was even worse, because Paul was never accused of any crime or convicted of any crime. And ultimately, he was killed in custody. So what happened was I started visiting Paul at Burnaby Hospital on April 15th, and I was allowed a 10-minute visit every day. And it appeared to me miraculously that Paul was recovering. And I was trained as a psychologist, and I worked with incapable adults in British Columbia. I was a government psychologist. And so I know, I can assess mental capacity. And he appeared to be improving. And I had posted here on Facebook when Paul had set up, when I visited him, I had brought him a big coffee table book of movie stars that a neighbor had given me for him. And it was a great big book, great big heavy book. He grabbed it from my hands and he turned the pages perfectly. And he scanned them. He looked at the pages appropriately, and he kept only his right eye, or his right eye was less affected. So he looked at me appropriately with his right eye. And he had an oxygen mask on the whole time. So on April 21st at 6:30, I got a phone call from the Burnaby RCMP, and they said they had just been ordered. And what I find out now is that a month earlier, they had been ordered by Ottawa to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. What I allege is a fraudulent and forged power of attorney over Paul. So the actual letter to me was a month old by April 21st. So I was so excited. I thought, oh my God, my prayers are answered. Somebody's finally listening to me. I had been interviewed by an investigator with the Ottawa Oversight Agency for the RCMP, and they took me seriously. It was the only government worker I've ever spoken to was a man named Paul who interviewed me like I was a witness and asked all the right questions and followed up. And then they ordered the Burnaby RCMP to open an investigation into their response to the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. So I get this call from the Burnaby RCMP, and I was so excited. I thought, oh, this is a breakthrough. I can free Paul. I prepared an application to have the minister responsible for Paul's care take over from the evil nun who had flown in from Ontario. But we didn't get on before judge the next morning. But the nun knew, the lawyer for the nun knew that I had been informed. What I think is that the Burnaby RCMP tipped off the nun a month before me that there was an investigation. And when he found out that I knew, then he ordered the nun. What I believe, in my opinion, is that my sister's a Vancouver lawyer, and I filed a letter with the court setting this out. So what I believe is that he phoned her or texted her or emailed her, and he told her, take away Paul's oxygen mask and have him sedated. Now, Paul did not need to be sedated. He was struggling to recover. I even posted on Facebook that Paul had set up, and he was turning the pages of the book appropriately, and that he appeared to be in recovery. And I had written the hospital. I put out, to anyone who I thought could help, I begged them to treat him as being in recovery, not as being in palliative care, because to me, in my assessment, he was recovering. But as soon as the nun knew that I had been informed by the RCMP that she was being investigated, the fraudulent and forged power of attorney was being investigated, Paul had to die, and he had to die quick. So when I saw him on April 22nd, the evening of April 22nd, his oxygen mask had been removed, and he appeared to me to be dead. He did not look alive to me, although the nun wouldn't let me near his head. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She said, say goodbye to Paul, he's dying. But she wouldn't look me in the eye. And if I can give any of you guys a tip on deception detection, it's if someone does not look you in the eye when they are making an assertion, they're lying. Although really good liars can look you in the eye. They can look you straight in the eye and lie. But most people cannot look you in the eye and lie. So Paul appeared to me to be dead. His eyes were wide open and unfocused. His hand was completely unresponsive. He was 100% unresponsive, although his hand wasn't cold or stiff. So this would have been about 5:30 on April 22nd, after the nun learned that I had found out that she was being investigated by the RCMP, or that her fraudulent and forged power of attorney was being investigated by the RCMP. Now, mind you, the Burnaby RCMP had been ordered to do an investigation by Ottawa. So they were dragging their feet. They were slow walking the investigation. They didn't want to find out that they had mishandled it and that my brother had been locked up for 588 days because they hadn't properly investigated my complaint. They didn't want to know that, and they didn't want to find that out, and I don't blame them. But, it is what it is. He was locked up for 588 days because they didn't investigate the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. So I left, and then I get an email from the evil nun saying that Paul had died at 10:15 on April 23rd, 10:15 a.m. on April 23rd, but she would hold the body till 2 o'clock so I could come and look at it. Then after that, the evil nun's lawyers pursue a claim to find me a vexatious litigant. And they bring on this huge application to have me found a vexatious litigant after when I'm coping with the tragedy of watching my brother be murdered before my very eyes, which is what I believe happened, in my opinion. I mean, how many people watch their loved one be murdered right in front of their eyes? He's my last relative left from my family of origin, from a great big family in the Lower Mainland. And I was his last visitor. So until you go through that, you can't imagine what it's like. So the hearing to have me found a vexatious litigant took place on November 18th for 4 days. And the judge was Judith E. Hoffman. And I pointed out to her, I have medical certificates saying I'm only allowed to attend a court for 2 hours per day. And when it was 12 o'clock, I stood up and I said, well, I can't stay longer. Every other judge has accommodated those medical certificates from my cardiologist and my family doctor. So I stood up. I had a heart attack in 2016. I've got high blood pressure and lupus. I almost died from a kidney infection, and I had last rites in May of 2021. So my health, is not the greatest. So I stood up and I said, well, I can't stay any longer. My time is up. And the Judith Hoffman said, oh, can't you just sit in the gallery? So there was 2 big law firms acting for the Catholic Church on one side and me by myself on the other side over hearing to take away all of my civil rights, the most basic civil rights, to defend myself. And she tells me, why don't you sit in the gallery? And then she went on for 2 full days after that. So, of course, I appealed. And the case management conference for the appeal was just this Monday. And I told the registrar, I said, this is the worst miscarriage of justice in Canadian history. And, of course, no lawyer wants to help me or represent me publicly, although lots of them will give me advice privately. But, they don't want to have happen to them what's been done to me. So, and the nun's lawyer stood up and said that there was no police investigation. What I had asked the judge, the vexatious litigant judge, Judith Hoffman, I said, ask for an adjournment until the police had finished their investigation, because they will know things that I don't know or don't have access to. Of course, she said no. So the nun's lawyer stood up and said there was no evidence of a police investigation. So I just wrote the registrar letter yesterday attaching the 2 reports of the 2 investigations being done by the Burnaby RCMP as ordered by their oversight agency. And I wrote a letter just saying that I believe that my sister's lawyer told her to have my brother's, Paul's, oxygen mask removed and to sedate him to death on April 22nd. So once he knew that I knew that there was an investigation that was ongoing, Paul had to die. If you can imagine that. It's like this nightmare that never ends. And so that's it. And I thought they wouldn't file the letter, because you have to file letters to the registrar. And I thought, they're not going to file a letter. It just says that once the lawyer knew that I had been told about these 2 investigations into the Burnaby RCMP had been ordered to investigate the fraudulent forged power of attorney, that within 24 hours of me receiving those reports, Paul was dead. And that I believe, and I saw that his oxygen mask had been removed. And he appeared to me, and I found an email that I wrote to the social worker on the ward saying that it appeared to me that he was being over-sedated. And could they get a second opinion? So I literally watched my little brother, who I love more than anything in the world, and who wanted to live. He just wanted to be left alone. Like maybe he wouldn't have lived. I don't know. But he didn't need to have his oxygen mask removed and to be sedated to death with opioids. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for the people that have followed this story. It should be, Canada just goes through this over and over and over again with these horrific miscarriages of justice. And then afterwards, there's a lot of wringing of hands. And, oh my God, how did that ever slip through? And I just want to say, if you're in the justice system, if you're involved in the justice system as a lawyer or a judge or a court clerk or whatever, if somebody is vulnerable and disabled, listen to them more, not less. Because it's more likely that that they're not foolish. My brother Paul never said a foolish thing in his life. Every single thing that he said had a kernel of truth to it. And I told the courts, we were in front of maybe 10 different judges, and I told them over and over and over again that this was a miscarriage of justice and that Paul was being abused. And they dismissed me because I'm a disabled senior, former lawyer. And of course, Paul was a disabled person with Down syndrome. So they listened to the $500 an hour lawyers rather than us. Haven't we learned enough about the Catholic Church? I mean, the 215 bodies that are buried beside the residential school in Kamloops. I mean, haven't we learned enough? Do we have to keep on making the same mistakes over and over and over again? There's no excuse for it. And Canada is at risk of losing its sovereignty because of its ill treatment of its most vulnerable people. That will be the excuse that Donald Trump will use when he invades us and takes all our resources, our oil, and our electric power. It'll be that we treated our most vulnerable citizens with disrespect. Anyways, that's it for now. Thank you again to all my wonderful friends who take the time to listen to this story. We can't let this happen over and over and over again. Take care. Have a wonderful day.